empezamos ya porque vamos con retraso. Vale, perfecto. It doesn't work, so he has to. When they said we can go, we go. Hola, buenas tardes. Con un poquito de retraso. ¿Funciona el micrófono o no funciona? Sí funciona, vale, bien. Con un poquito de retraso vamos a empezar con el profesor Gunther Kress, que nos va a hablar sobre lo social en los medios sociales, algunas cuestiones acerca de la comunicación, poder y fuentes de representación. Pero antes de que empiece el profesor Gunther Kress, quiero presentarle. El profesor Gunther Kress es profesor de semiótica y educación en el Instituto de Educación de la Universidad de Londres. Sus intereses se focalizan en los principios de la comprensión de la representación. Meaning making, como dice él, que yo lo he traducido, si hay alguien aquí que sabe más inglés que yo me puede corregir, como la construcción del significado de la comunicación en entornos sociales contemporáneos. Esto implica una continua inclinación en el desarrollo de la teoría semiótica social de representación multimodal y en la comunicación. Para él, esto implica una orientación en los procesos y formas de comunicación en todos los estilos del discurso, incluida la escritura. Ha publicado varios libros como Learning to Write, Aprender a escribir, Linguistic Processes in Social Practices, Sociocultural Practices, Social Semiotics. Y ha escrito también un libro sobre Reading Image, pero traducidos a la lengua española tiene que es Alfabetización en la era de los nuevos medios de comunicación, y tiene otro interesante, desde mi punto de vista, sobre un enfoque, a ver si lo encuentro, un enfoque semiótico social a la comunicación contemporánea. Es decir, la semiótica, donde él hace mucho hincapié en esta semiótica social. Es decir, busca las palabras adecuadas a la frase que él quiere decir en su momento. Por lo tanto, dicho esto, yo creo que vamos a darle la palabra. It's your turn, Dr. Kress, for explaining your lesson today.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I can confirm that it's all true. It's a great pleasure to be here. My pleasure is slightly tinged by the fact that I can't speak to you in Spanish. Spain is one of the favorite countries that I like to be in. And Spanish is a language I'd love to be able to speak, but too late did I come back from Australia to make that effort. But anyway, some of the things which I will be saying may be different to the ways people normally talk about communication. So I will ask you to be patient and maybe sort of say it'll slowly become clear. I hope so anyway. I was saying to some of the people who were kind of escorting me and hosting me earlier, I'm a pedant. I like things to be named precisely. And especially now, when times are changing and we all know that the present moment, or the present decades, is a period of intense change, there is a temptation to name things by names which were familiar in a former time, but which don't really quite fit for the kinds of things we're naming now. So, for instance, in my title, when I suggested it, I wondered why we talk about social media. Because you could ask, which media are not social? Yeah? I mean, which media are not social? So what is it that makes us put the word social in front of social media? Obviously, we want to signal something has changed. And so a big question is not to name something quickly and think it's done, but rather to say, why are we naming this thing social media? What has changed? What do we need to understand about these media? And of course, it isn't the case that lots of people haven't thought about that, but those are the kinds of things that interest me and bother me. And instead of, say, using the term literacy in the way that it is fashionable at the moment, I want to say, let's name this kind of stuff more precisely. Literacy for me means writing, the cultural technology of writing. But when I look at images, I sort of think, am I really talking about visual literacy? Where are the sentences in images? Where are the words in images? Where are the commas? Where are the full stops? Where are the exclamation marks? There aren't any. I'm talking about a different resource for representation. And to name it very quickly as visual literacy, or more broadly even in relation to the media, to name something as media literacy, I feel I've begun to lose control of what I really want to say. I've got a name, but the name is empty. So that's something that bothers me. So maybe I'll kind of do things which are a bit kind of pedantic, but as an academic, I think my job is to be very careful and try to explain things in such a way that they actually begin to mean something that they should be meaning. Now, I'll see whether this works. Where do I need to point this to make it work? It isn't at the moment working.
Have the same then.
Pardon?
Here's the same behavior.
Okay. So I want to make a distinction, for instance, between the social and the cultural. Quite often those two terms are used in the same way. And I think it's very important to make a distinction. The social, I think, is a field of action. The social is a field of action in which power is always present. So when I think about social media, I talk about kinds of actions in mediating meanings in which power is present in some form or other. Culture, for me, on the other hand, names a domain of resources, things that are available to me to do things with. So I'm going to make a kind of a distinction between the social and the cultural. The social media are a field of action in which power is present, and in that field of action I use cultural tools, cultural resources, cultural technologies to do the kinds of things I want to do. I want to talk about interaction, and interaction as work. When we interact, we're doing semiotic work. But when we work, we do things deliberately. And so everything I do as work is deliberately done. So therefore, when I do semiotic work, it's entirely legitimate for anybody to say, why did you do this? Yeah. To ask, why did you do this? Because it's reasonable to assume I did this for a purpose. And in the kind of theory that I'm trying to use, everything I do is done for a purpose, and somebody can therefore say, what was the purpose in this person doing this kind of thing there? The resources which the culture gives me are material resources, such as image, writing, speech, gesture, sound in various ways. And they're also conceptual resources. For instance, resources such as the notion of discourse. Notions like genre, for instance. How do we form texts? These are conceptual resources. Conceptual resources are brought together with material resources to make texts as messages in the way that we, at a particular moment, in relation to particular circumstances, in particular environments. What is it I can do with writing that I can't do with image? What is it I can do with image that I can't do with writing? Or what can I do with a gesture that I can do neither with image or with writing? what are the limitations of gesture? What are the limitations of writing? And one of the things which is important now is once we have several modes, resources for representation, we can say we're always using some of these together, and therefore each one of them is actually making a part of the meaning of the whole. Each of these modes, my gesture is making some meaning, my facial expression is making some meaning, what I'm saying is making meaning, my tone of voice is making meaning. All of these things are making meaning together, but what that means is that any one of these ever only makes part of the meaning of my message. And in relation to what we call language, that's quite a profound thing to say, because it's saying, unlike what in the West we have thought for a long time, it is saying language is not a full means of representation, but language is always partial, a partial means of representation. And in the West we have relied on the fact that everything I could think, feel, want to express, represent, could be done through either speech or writing. And what multimodality says, the presence of many modes for making meaning, it says no, actually there are some things you cannot do with speech or with writing, and therefore we supplement these things with image or with sound or with other kinds of things. A whole new field of research is opening up. And of course, given the intensity of the presence of contemporary media, the digital media, which make it possible to have all these means together in a particular appliance or on a screen, that question, what can this medium do, what can this mode do, this resource of representation, what can it do, and why am I using it here, becomes important as a big area of research for academics, especially academics interested in the screens and the function and uses of screens in society. So, for me, I'm not a psychologist. I believe that we have a brain, and I think the brain has a function. It is one of our more important muscles. But for me, rather than saying the cognitive is prior, I say the social is prior. It is in social environments that we use our brains. We use our brains, of course. The brain is a kind of receptacle, storehouse, a means of transforming things, but it transforms things which come from the social. The social is prior. And so therefore, in the kind of communicational theory that I adopt, I want to have a rhetorical stance. I want to say, going back to old forms of thinking about this, but not using the old terms, the teacher in a classroom, for instance, is a rhetor. She or he attempts to understand what his or her audience is about. They're 7 years old. They're boys and girls together. They come from a range of ethnic or cultural groups and social groups. How can I make something enjoyable for them? How can I make it such that they can actually understand it, engage with it, remember it, so that they can be interested in it? That's the rhetor's task. What resources do I have to appeal to this group of 7-year-olds, boys and girls, different social backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds? That's what the rhetor says. But the rhetor says that whether she or he is talking about 7-year-olds or 70-year-olds, the rhetorical stance is essential in a society which is no longer stable. In a stable society, I could rely on convention to know that in this particular situation, this is what I should do. In an unstable society, and Anglophone societies are unstable, and I'm making this a case about, say, the place where I live and work, England is profoundly unstable. And the state is actively engaged in smashing up the stability of the social. Because we're all free, we're all individuals, we don't need the kind of fetters of stability. So in an unstable situation, each time I encounter somebody and communicate with that person, I need to assess what is the situation of communication. Who is the person? Who is the group with whom I'm communicating? I need to make these rhetorical assessments each time newly. And what are the means whereby I can make my message, my meaning clear to this particular group? So the rhetorical stance, and I think, especially when you are interested in, for instance, communicating online, or when you're educators who use the internet as a means of communicating, where you have absolutely no sense really who is on the other end of the message that you're receiving, the notion of rhetoric and how can I make this communicable to what I assume to be my audience becomes absolutely crucial. Now, instead of talking about literacy in every context, verbal literacy, of course, and visual literacy, and computer literacy, and media literacy, I want to say, introduce a new term, which I have been told is perfectly straightforward in Spanish, the term mode. So I say the mode of image, the mode of gesture, the mode of speech, the mode of writing, the mode of music. All of these are modes which enable me to make meanings differently. Music can make meanings which speech cannot make, and gesture can make meanings which writing cannot make. But when I combine them, then I can get a rich account of the meaning I want to make at a particular moment. The media for me are quite separate from these means of making my meanings material. Yeah? I make my meaning material by writing something and I supplement it with an image. The media, however, are the means I use for disseminating these texts which I've made. Texts as messages are disseminated by the media, various kinds of media. So for me, these are quite separate. And so therefore, conjunctions like media literacy is for me a kind of an impossible term, because medium names, that which I use to disseminate my meanings, and mode names that whereby I make my meanings, in image, in speech, in music, in moving image, in writing, and so forth. Yeah? So the media, I managed to spell facilities badly here. It's a typo. I actually know that there's an L missing. The media make me ask, what are the facilities of this particular technology for disseminating meaning as message? Is Facebook what I want to use? Or is it YouTube? Or is it MySpace? Or something else? Do I want to write a blog? So I asked a question which is about the medium, and I asked quite a separate question which is about the modes whereby I make my meanings material. And of course, in all of this, always, I'm aware that I'm talking to groups who are socially formed. They have social relations with each other. I have a social relation with that group. And the genre is therefore for me really, really important, because the genre is actually the intexting of a relation with my audience. And so then I can ask, if I'm using Facebook or Twitter, what kind of genre can I produce? Can I produce a genre of interview? Can I produce a genre of report? Can I produce a genre of narrative with tweets? My answer is, well, actually, no, you can't. Yeah? So the medium prohibits the existence of certain kinds of social relations and the textual forms, the semiotic forms, which would kind of make these textual relations concrete in semiotic form. So the medium isn't neutral in that respect. It says, well, actually, if you want to tweet, the narrative isn't the best genre to imagine. A tweet is something quite different. And if you have Facebook, that's again something else. The media actually suggests certain kinds of social relations, but you can turn that around and say, I would like certain kinds of social relations, which are differently constituted to the tweet, and so therefore you say, I will avoid this particular medium for this particular thing, I'll go to different mediums. So these things for me are enormously significant. Some of these modes, these means of making meanings material, of course happen in time. Speech happens in time, gesture happens in time, music happens in time, ballet happens in time, and some are not in time, some are in space. A still image is a spatial instantiation of meaning. And it matters whether something is temporally instantiated, because in the temporal instantiation, you as an audience and I as a maker of meaning can make first part in the temporal entity significant, and I can make last part in the entity significant. And of course, in a spatial representation, there isn't the first and the last. but there are different kinds of relations. Yeah? For instance, marginal and central, top and bottom. So the image, because it is the still image, because it's spatially instantiated, doesn't offer me the possibility of making something first, but it says you can make something central. So it offers me the possibility of making something salient, making it significant in some way, but in different means. Yeah? And so if I'm using screens for communicating with an audience I barely know, these are important questions. Which is the best mode, the spatial or the temporal, and why? So this is the kind of question I ask, the potentials and the limitations of modes. In what I'm telling you now, or going to tell you over the next little while, I will draw on different kinds of research I've done, and in one or two instances on research which colleagues of mine have done. And actually, when I was invited to come here, I said to Roberto, I said, I know nothing about social media. And I really meant it. I might have said something like, I'm the second most ignorant person in the world about social media, because I assume there might be somebody, somewhere, who's even more ignorant. He wrote back and said, but I quite like the sorts of things you write. I suspect he needed somebody to fill this spot, and so that's why I'm here. My colleagues are very interested in screen media, of course, because in every classroom in London now there are interactive whiteboards. And teaching is being changed in the most profound way by the presence of interactive whiteboard, which gives you a totally different resource to draw on and a relation with students. Anyway, most of my examples are not from what is the focus of this symposium, this seminar, that is social media, but I think what I have to say about communication might be possible for you to translate into the kinds of interests which you have. So now we're going to be with a class of 7-year-olds who come from a primary school in Clapham Junction in London, and the teacher has taken them to the British Museum. And on the day after the visit to the British Museum, the teacher has said to them, I want you to write me a story of the visit to the British Museum, and then I want you to draw me a picture of the visit. My point in showing you this is to say, does it matter whether I ask children, or anybody for that matter, to draw a picture or to write a story? Okay, so here then is one story, and it's quite representative by this 7-year-old. He says, or writes, when I got to the museum, it looked bigger than I thought. When I went in, I took off my coat and went into the men's toilet, and after I ran upstairs, I went into the lift. Then I went to see the mummies and all their stuff. Then we went to our cloakroom so we can get our coat. And then we went to Waterloo Station on a tube and a train to Clapham Junction and walked back to school and went home very happy. And I told my mum, sister and my brother. The end. Okay, it's written, but you can see it leans very heavily on speech. It is actually organized by temporality, by the chronology of the day. It leans on temporality as its organizing principle. Now let's look at the picture that this young man drew. And this is the picture he drew. Now you could say, okay, do we pay attention to what 7-year-olds do? And the answer might be, well, it's childish, no, we'll ignore that. Or we can say, maybe a child, a 7-year-old child, can actually tell us something which is important. And I think what is important for me here is then when you ask somebody to represent something, the recollection of something, in a temporally instantiated medium, it is likely that the representation will be temporally organized. Yeah, speech is temporally organized, and writing at this stage in the child's life is still organized temporally. But when you say to the child, represent it visually, then a different set of principles appears, which is what in the visual recollection were the things which are most salient for you, and how do they relate to each other? And what was most salient, and you can see that in the little story that he wrote, He thought the museum was much bigger than he had imagined. It looked bigger than I thought, and you can see that the facade of the British Museum is something which he kind of represents. It's impressive. And he talked about the mummies and all those stuff, and they're there, but the representation, its representation is not about what is first and what is second, or in what sequence did it occur, but rather a very different kind of organization. Yeah? Now transpose that to a 17-year-old who has to do something about physics. Is it better to have a verbal instantiation, which makes one kind of requirement, or a visual representation, which makes a different kind of requirement? This is the question that lies behind me. The other question which lies behind me, and this is the point about the social media, if the social media prevent, for instance, certain kinds of genres from being produced, and therefore point to very different kinds of social relations, it may be that we should ask, if we use the visual all the time, will it habituate us to see the world in different terms? Not in terms of sequences of actions and events, but in terms of salient entities and their relations in space. And so behind all this are these questions. What do the social media actually privilege in terms of the representational modes? Do they privilege image? Do they privilege writing? Writings of what kind? And what is the consequence? I've already attempted to say, in terms of genres, social relations, there's a real kind of impact there, a kind of a force that prevents or makes possible certain kinds of things. In terms of modal representation, similarly. So now you come to think, okay, well, we're dealing with university students or we're dealing with school students. Is there kind of any application in this? Of course, when you now deal with university students who have gone through school and have just moved into university, you're dealing with people who actually have already become habituated both to these media and to these modes of representation. Because there's actually now a generational divide, which is round about the age of maybe 30, 35, or maybe a little bit younger. Below that age, the new media are not new. They're the media. And these new modes of representation are not new. They are what's normal. And so there's a generational divide. And we, as educators, are dealing with groups of people for whom what was normal for me is no longer normal. What was naturalized for me is no longer naturalized for them. Okay. A different example, which comes from a research project I did with a colleague who was professor of science education, about science education for 13, 14-year-olds. And this little example comes from a lesson, the fourth lesson in a series of lessons on plant cells. So the children have seen plant cells, they've seen models of plant cells, lots has been talked about, and they've read about plant cells. And in the fourth lesson, the teacher says, can anybody tell me something about cells? And somebody puts up a hand and she says, yes, Susie. And Susie says, a cell has a nucleus, miss. A cell has a nucleus. Two nominal entities connected by a verb of possession, and that is the knowledge. This is how the knowledge of about plant cells is configured by this girl in response to the question, the prompt by the teacher, can you tell me something about a plant cell? Then she says, Susie, come to the board and draw it. This is before the era of the interactive whiteboard on which you can't now draw. And Susie gets to the front. The question which she now has to answer is not how many entities are there that I know and how are they related, but rather, where is the nucleus located? How big is the nucleus? Is it a dot? Is it a circle? Is it a large dot? Is it near the cell wall or is it near the center of the cell? Entirely different questions. Same knowledge, seemingly, but the moment you move to a different mode of representation, different questions appear. So she draws something like this, which is relatively accurate. The nucleus is near the cell wall. It's about that kind of size in relation to the cell overall. The point I'm wanting to make is that by representing in writing, you're forced into certain kinds of epistemological commitments. You have to say, this has that. When you ask the person to represent that knowledge in drawing, you're forced into a different epistemological commitment because you can't avoid putting the nucleus somewhere. And wherever you put it, you've committed to yourself to saying that's where it is. Yeah? A different commitment. So visual representation forces us into a different epistemology and a different kind of commitment to verbal representation, whether, well, speech would be different again to writing. And these are things which are profound at every level, not only at the level of 13 and 14-year-olds learning science in school, but also at university and also much later in life. How do I represent it? What about my knowledge do I wish to represent in what kind of way? What kinds of commitments do I want to avoid? And you can never avoid commitments. There's always a commitment, but you can choose which you want to avoid and which will I choose. Okay. The point I'm wanting to make is that with the new media, there's an intensification of that kind of question because the relative ease of using image as against writing or speech, moving images against still image, having a soundtrack overlaying all of this. These are relatively easy means of making a representation, and so these questions become intense. Of course, as I said before, when we use representations, when we make our messages, when we speak, when we do these things, we always put modes together, and I talk about that in terms of orchestrating modes. It's much as a composer who composes a piece of music says, I'd like this bit to be played by a flute, and I'd like this bit to be played by, a trombone, and this bit to be played, and you orchestrate your piece in different ways for a specific kind of effect. And I think that kind of thing is now going to be commonplace in all kinds of representations that we make. And if we think about the future of language, broadly speaking, or writing much more specifically, we have to think about writing now in that kind of orchestration, because writing might disappear in many orchestrations. It may not be the thing that is important, or it may become quite marginal. It may be sort of on the margins of something. It may not be the central kind of issue. But because I have many means of making my meaning, the question is not one of competently doing so, which it could be in writing. Are you a competent writer? Yes, I can write sentences. Can you make yes, I can make a complex sentence. Can you punctuate? Yeah, I can punctuate properly. The question now is not that of competence. The question is, can you design your message in the best way possible for this particular audience, given the kinds of things you want to communicate to this audience and the means you have available? Design moves into the foreground. Now, I work in an educational institution concerned with the education of young people. At the moment, competence is what our government strives for, while at the same time saying young people must be innovative and creative and adaptable to change, but they must kind of rigidly obey the rules which we learned 50 years ago. And I say, well, actually nonsense. Young people need to be able to make the meanings they want to make in the best way possible. They have to become designers of their meanings, which they will put into the world using the media which they think are best for their purposes. So design moves into the center, and the social effects of these ensembles, of course, is a question. The effect of one kind of an ensemble might be very pleasurable to one group, and it might be completely off-putting, negative for a different group. So these become very, very sensitive questions. Now, this is not from a research project, but from my everyday experience. I go to work on a bus. I go to work on a double-decker bus, being in London. And every morning, when I get to, the bus rather gets to a certain kind of intersection, it's very busy, or even at 7 o'clock in the morning, it stops there. And here I see a sign of how to get into the car park of a supermarket. Yeah, fair enough, straightforward. It uses 3 modes. It uses writing, it uses image, and it uses color. Yeah? And you could say, why does it use 3 modes? I would respond and say, could you write all this down? And given that there is a busy intersection and there are cars all around you, 3 lines of cars next to you, would it be possible for the driver of the car to read what you would need to write in order to give these instructions? The answer would be no. Yeah? You couldn't. So in other words, you kind of put these modes together because image does something that writing doesn't do easily here or at all, and color does something else. For instance, the red line, which you may just see, highlights the route you should take. You put these things together because that's the best way of making the meaning you want to make, and if you didn't put them together, it just wouldn't work. Now, on the other side of the same road is this sign, another supermarket, Waitrose. It uses writing, it uses color, and it uses a diagram, an image. Yeah, same modes as before, for roughly the same reasons, but in a somewhat different style. Now, it may be that some of you have spent time in London and know something about Waitrose and Morrison's, but for those of you who haven't had much experience of these two supermarkets, I might ask a slightly different, odd question, namely, if you had a choice to go to that supermarket or to go to this supermarket, where would you go? Most people say Waitrose, even though they don't. So there is something about, I think, about middle-classness. I don't want to offend you by that term. But there's something about middle-classness that this selection of modes, but in this particular style, font, color scheme, yeah, it says, this is me. Yeah, this is me. This other thing here is very crude. It's kind of too kind of heavy. And I'm sure that if I went into that supermarket, I would find mothers who kind of smack their little children when they're not behaving. Whereas in Waitrose, the mothers would say, James, we don't do that sort of thing. Yeah, so these are not just geographical indicators. These are not just maps of how to get from one place to another. These are also social maps. And every representation is always at the same time a social representation. It says it locates me in a particular, or as a particular kind of identity. I feel comfortable with this. I don't feel comfortable with that. Now, of course, when you make representations for the internet, you have to bear that in mind. You're making representations which are not directly, straightforwardly representations of, say, a bottle, but they're also representations of a bottle which appeal to somebody or not appeal to somebody in terms of their subjectivity, in terms of their identity. So these things cannot be avoided. Okay, so orchestration is always dependent on design. Design is always dependent on a rhetorical assessment, and the result is, of course, a particular style. And style, I've said here as a kind of a slogan, is always the effect of choice. And because the choice is always constrained by all sorts of things, I've called it the politics of choice. Yeah? So you're making a political statement even when you make the most banal representation. And that's the case whether you're making it like I am now here in this kind of way, or whether you're making it on the internet, and that has to be borne in mind constantly. In the two images I've shown you, you could say these modes are specialized. Image shows, writing tells, and color kind of provides coherence and also highlights. And I'm using these images, or rather the designers who did that used these images in terms of the affordances which they offered. So in taking a rhetorical stance and in designing, you're also designing a potential world in which the person who will engage with this design will feel comfortable or not feel comfortable. Now, you're not just kind of designing something. And that applies to all media. It applies to blogs, it applies to Facebook, it applies to whatever they are. So in designing, you want to construct a coherent world, not somebody where somebody says, why is this color here? Or why is this in this particular place? But something is coherent and you're comfortable. What are the social characteristics of? What are the salient features of what is to be communicated? What are the resources which I have to hand? And design says, a good design says, everything that should be there is there, and it's in the place where it should be. And I think if you design a website or a blog or whatever it is, this is a kind of an underlying assumption about what you should be doing. And that should be guiding it. And there isn't, in that kind of sense of communication, anything which is banal. There isn't such a thing as banality. Everything is significant. Because everything, among other things, is also a social kind of indicator of who I am. And I'll skip past these things because I don't want to make my talk overly long. But I just wanted to show that there's a relation at every level between representation and other things. So this is a 3.5-year-old learning to write in an alphabetic script system, a 3.5 learning to write in a character-based script system. This is how they learn to write in sort of squared bits of paper. But the point is you learn to make the character so it balances in a square. And that is a habit which you continue. The square and things balancing in the square is a habit you take away. And so it's no surprise that timelines in the West are linear, but that the representation of time in this case Japan, but also in China, is not linear, but modular and central, because that's an underlying disposition. It's not surprising, there's another instance of it, it's not surprising that you get your Japanese meal in something which is modularized, which already prefigures what you're going to have. Yeah, these little bits of modules say this much wasabi sauce and this much vegetable and this much fish, and it goes there, and that's where the rice goes. Things are kind of ordered, but this is an ordered society. In England, I think at the moment, yes, of course, you go to a Japanese takeaway and you get this, but this actually suggests an ordered society where you know what a meal is going to be like. It's reliable from day to day. It's dependable. So design happens in time and in place, and of course social time is history, so it always happens at a particular point in history, and that's important, because if I'm designing for somebody of my age, I know that that person has a very different history, different set of experiences, and of course it's the social place is the culture, and you have to be aware of that. I'll go past that, except to say that I did with a colleague a research project on teaching materials over the last 80 years from 1930 to 2010 to see how these things changed and what kinds of social changes were entailed, what kinds of changes in terms of the school subject were entailed. This is from 1936. Writing is dominant, image is there, but writing says everything you want to know. Image is there maybe to make something more memorable or kind of more understandable. By 1988, where this page comes from, image has taken over the function of communicating the central meaning of the curriculum. And writing doesn't tell you anything about circuits now. A fundamental shift. And so if you're the designer of teaching materials, you have to be aware that this is something which has happened, that in certain school subjects there's been a shift from writing as the means of representing what is significant to image as a means of representing that which is significant. So there are principles of composition, and they have social implications. The principles of composition are: what mode shall I use for this age group or for this cultural group or for this particular purpose? There's a shift, I want to say, from linearity to modularity. And the elements of composition, I'll point out in a moment, have changed. And of course, the social purposes of communication are also changing. And hence, I think there is this change from what we call maybe a hierarchically ordered society to a network society, from verticality to horizontality, where relatively speaking, and of course these are ideological statements, where relatively speaking people relate on a flat plane, equal, whereas before I saw myself locked into a hierarchical structure where I knew who was above me and who was below me, and I could adjust my communication accordingly. So if the dominant social organization now is network, we need to ask what kinds of social organization obtains in network and how they to be represented in the representation which I'm supplying for somebody. So an information book in 1927 It's called The Boy Electrician, and it was meant to, just as electricity became popular, stop young boys from 7 to 10 killing themselves when they made an electric bell or their own radio. By the 1990s, information books had become modular. This isn't saying, this book here is saying, start at the top left-hand corner and move all the way down to the right-hand bottom corner, because you must follow the order in which the author had laid out things for you to obtain. Here, the ordering is entirely different. It says, we want to design something for 11-year-olds. We think amphibians are interesting. How can we design a page in which somebody can kind of get interested in amphibians? The emphasis has changed from the authority of the author to the interest of the reader as designer. And children now, when they come to this book, now this is 1990, it's already 20 years old, make up their mind, I want to go to that particular thing at the top, that salamander kind of thing, because it seems most interesting, or the big skeleton, or something. The authority of the author has waned. If you're designing teaching materials now, the authority of the author, actually, by the audience for whom all of you will be designing things or teaching things, no longer exists. So the question is now, what is the interest of the audience, and how can I represent in my semiotic thing the interest of the audience? I use this example for a simple reason, because there is a temptation to say everything has changed with the use of new media. Well, no, because when these books were designed in the late 80s and early 90s, very, very few people had computers. Nobody had a laptop, because there weren't laptops. Now, this is a social change which is about power, the authority of the author as against the interest of the reader. And so a website which was designed or started in England in the year 2003 about poetry, right? For people who are interested in poetry. It's called the Poetry Archive. And this says something about, it says about us, who are we, and it uses conventional writing. This is satisfyingly, comfortingly traditional for somebody like me. Yeah? But it also has a site, or rather pages, screens, for young people who are interested in poetry, sort of 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds, which looks a bit different. Yeah? This is the site for the 7 to 10-year-olds. It doesn't have the ordering of this. It doesn't have the centrality of writing. It has this other kind of order which says, look, we know some kids are interested in poetry. We can't quite know what they're interested in. We'll just provide stuff. We'll make it coherent by a color scheme, maybe, and let them choose where they want to enter this site. Yeah? This no longer speaks of the authority of an author. It speaks of an attempt by a design team to capture an interest of an imagined audience. It's a fundamental change. Color is important because if 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds are interested in poetry, we think that they are sensitive souls. Yeah? So we wouldn't use primary colors. We wouldn't use colors which are intensely saturated. We use these pastel colors because we want to appeal to the sensitivity of these budding poets. You see my point. Everything that is here is designed. It may be not actually doing what ought to have been done, but certainly the intention was there to appeal to a particular kind of audience. Or the BBC website. It doesn't say kind of enter here, but it says what might attract you? What is your interest? And the child is the designer of her or his own route through the website. Now, what I think is happening a lot with the contemporary media is something more. I mean, here, the design team has said all of these things would be interesting to, say, an audience from between 7 and 12 years old, and we'll kind of put them down and we'll make them seem attractive. We'll add a soundtrack to it, and these things move a bit. These things at the top, they move. It'll be very attractive. In some ways, it's still traditional because the design team kind of makes it. Of course, the reader comes to it, engages with it in particular ways. But I think what is happening And that's still like that in a way. I think in a lot of contemporary media, something else is happening. And let me show you what I mean by communication in contemporary social media as a social navigation device. It's like having these kind of things on the windscreen of your car. What are they called? These these navigation things that you kind of stick on the, and you kind of look very closely as you run up the back of the car in front of you. These are social navigation devices. Let me show you why. Because what is this here really? So somebody here, a series of tweets. What is this person doing? This person is doing two kinds of things. He's constructing a community. People who are interested in health or in the English National Health Scheme. He's constructing this community by little snippets of stuff. This isn't a narrative. There isn't a narrative. There isn't a report. These are snippets of stuff. It's like gossip, like when you're walking past a group of people and you hear something, a little snippet of something. But what it's also doing, it's referring you on to other kinds of things. It makes this a kind of a hub from where you can go to other kinds of things. The communication here is less about massive amounts of content being communicated, which I have authored and pass on to you, but rather I'm in the center of a particular kind of web of things. I'm interested in this kind of thing. I'm forming a community of people who are interested in this, but I'm passing you on to other kinds of things which might also be interesting to you. And that's a fundamental change, because what composition is beginning to be about is no longer forming something even as seemingly unconventional or non-traditional as this, where still somebody assembled stuff for a particular group in a particular way. But composition is beginning to be much more like this, namely where I say, you could follow this and you could be also kind of engaged in this or located in this kind of network. That's an entirely different form of composition. And it isn't even like the form of composition which is much derided by teachers and teachers at university or in school, where people complain that, there's just cutting and pasting going on. Somebody goes on the internet and kind of cuts out stuff and pastes it. Something else is happening here, which makes, I think, traditional forms, traditional principles of communication no longer obtain in this kind of site here. Or similarly here on the right-hand column, different kinds of tweeters who are significant journalists in this newspaper, The Guardian. And what they do is basically sort of saying something but passing you on, so it sort of move you on to somewhere else. My computer wasn't allowing me to do proper screenshots, so this is the website of a restaurant, but you can see down there there's a little bit of a map and a little bit of what the inside of the restaurant looks like, and there's a timetable where you can book and stuff like that. And here's a comment from somebody. This is assemblage of a contemporary kind. This is no longer saying literacy in the old form allowed me, on the basis of letters and words and stuff, to make kind of this is kind of assembling stuff in a completely different, not random, by no means. So when we want to understand this, my first question is, what are the principles of selection and what are the principles of composition? Why is the map down there and why is something else in a different kind of place? Just as we asked with the drawing of the museum and the mummies of the 7-year-old.
5 minutes.
Don't need it.
5 minutes.
I want to just show that you have new media, you have social media, and you have traditional users. Because here's a different daily newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, in England, and a journalist who's in this little text that she writes. She writes a long text on this blog, and in the little text she says, "I'm not a blogger." Right? She's making a blog in which she kind of declares she's not a blogger. So you can use a kind of a new medium, a new platform, but you can kind of populate it still in a relatively traditional manner. So this is why I think the notion of the rhetoric is important, because you need to know who your audience is. So something about design. And I'll say, a simple question would be, If you put the images of the food on the other side and had the text, the written text on the left, what would be the difference in meaning? I mean, those kinds of questions, extremely banal questions, and I think the meaning would be completely different. Facebook, I'll just go past this. I want to finish with a very, very quick notion about learning, because the conference is concerned, among other things, with what it calls digital learning. I don't know whether digital learning is a new form of learning, which has kind of reconfigured the genetics of my brain, or a new generation's brain, or whether it actually means learning in digital environments, digitally mediated environments. A notion of communication from the early 20th century was something happens in my head, I sort of do something, it goes to your head, you do something, it comes back to my head. I want to say, let's have a realistic model of communication, a realistic model, something that happens every day, constantly, a normal model, not this other one, which hardly happens. So I have been doing for 5 years quite a bit of work in operating theatres. And here you have a photo of an actual operation. The person nearest you is somebody who in English is called a scrub nurse, that is, she can participate, she has sterile hands. She can, scrub nurse, chief surgeon, assistant surgeon, anaesthetist, and just on the right over there you see a little bit of the operating theatre technician. 4 professions with different traditions, different ways of thinking, different responsibilities, all focused on one task. How does communication happen here? Yes, there is speech, but quite often and most usually the speech is not about the operation, but about the holiday which the surgeon has just had, or the fact that he can't get beds for his private patients or whatever. But the communication is happening by the scrub nurse moving slightly towards the head surgeon because she's about to pass an instrument. The head surgeon might put his hand on the hand of the assistant surgeon. The scrub nurse might look at the assistant surgeon and he thinks, why is she looking at me? A whole lot of stuff is going on. It's not as me communicating with you, but stuff is going on and I make a decision, this must be for me. This is meant for me. And I kind of, out of this mess of stuff, kind of cut something out, regardless of the prompt for me to act. Yeah, that turns the notion of communication entirely on its head, because what it says is communication happens as my response to something which I've made into a prompt for me. And also communication happens when there is interpretation. I won't say much about that. Communication happens when there is interpretation. Think about that in the classroom. Communication does not happen when you've put materials on Blackboard or on the... communication happens when there's interpretation. Let me give you a few instances of this as a problem. Another research project with colleagues in Sweden on museum visitors. Among other things, we asked the visitors, always in pairs, at the end to draw a little map which would represent their sense of what the museum was, the exhibition was about. In Sweden, it was called Prehistoric Sweden. In London, at the Museum of London, it was called London Before London. The exhibition was in Stockholm was in 5 rooms. This person has kind of made a few more rooms, and she's populated the rooms with writing. Somebody else in Stockholm, same exhibition, different interests, makes this the map. Now you might say, in a school you might say to the child, that's not a map. Can you, can you do better? You can't say that to a museum visitor, and you can't fail a museum visitor. You can't give them 0 marks out of 10. In London, London Before London, an 11-year-old dragged along unwillingly to see this exhibition, makes this as his map of the exhibition, because in the exhibition there's a little diorama that says on the present side of Heathrow Airport there's a very important Neolithic, or was a very important Neolithic settlement, and they put a model of an aeroplane there, and that attracted his attention. But 2 young German women, 18-year-olds, who came to England to learn something about England, one of them did a completely different map. She did this as a map. So which of these maps is correct? These are all interpretations of something which each of these people at this moment have taken as a prompt from a hugely complex exhibition. It should tell us something about theories of learning which focus too much on the teacher and the curriculum and focus not at all on the interpretive selective and transformative action of the learner everywhere, even in conditions of power, and particularly in conditions which you, if you're providing stuff on the web, can hardly control. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. A ver, ¿hay alguna pregunta que se le quiera formular al profesor Gunther Kress? They can ask you by Twitter the question. Maybe then they can.
They weren't tweeting.
Yeah. And then you answer. A ver, todos aquellos alumnos que estén en Twitter pueden empezar ya a mandar las preguntas que quieran hacerle al profesor Gunther Kress. ¿Alguna pregunta en la sala?
Sí, muchas gracias. Una pregunta, bueno, aparte de ser magnífica toda la presentación, había un punto al principio que, sobre el que quería preguntar, porque me ha dejado pillado. Es el ejemplo del alumno, del niño que visita el British Museum, el Museo Británico. Si a ese niño se le preguntaba, se le pedía que hiciera una representación textual de su visita y luego una representación visual de su visita. Entonces, si el niño hubiera, primero hubiera hecho una descripción detallada de la sala de la momia, con texto, y luego hubiera dibujado un storyboard del día completo, ¿qué habrían hecho ustedes con ese niño? Gracias.
Can the translators please repeat the last point? No, but before then. I would have done... Sorry, go on. For a start, that naughty child had not obeyed what I told the child, namely to draw a picture. And so he would have been stood in the corner. It wasn't I who did it. It was the teacher who asked the questions. I would have looked at the storyboard. And I would have looked at what the child had represented visually and what the child had represented verbally. That would have been a very interesting issue. Because he would have had a choice of making that selection. So I think whenever somebody makes a representation, that would be, for me, the first question: what has the person selected to use for what kind of purpose? And I would take the 7-year-old's selection and representation as seriously as anybody else's.
¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿No hay más preguntas? Pues yo le voy a formular una. I'm going to ask you something, but I will do in Spanish to translate to you. No es fácil que un alumno de edades de primaria sepan realmente hacer una redacción si ellos anteriormente no han vivido el hecho. Contar temporalmente, como el ejemplo que nos ha puesto usted, es lo lógico en una redacción así. ¿No habría en un primer momento quizá haber guiado un poquito más al alumno para que hubiera hecho otro tipo de redacción?
Well, my notion of the prompt is important because the teacher gave one kind of prompt and the child responded in his terms to that prompt. If the teacher had given a different prompt, the child would have still interpreted the prompt. So I think for me, the important thing is to kind of look at the transformative and interpretative activity of the child in relation to the prompt. Rather than sort of, I'm wanting to get away, I mean, one of the things I'm really, really interested in is in this new world, differently mediated, differently represented, in a schooling system which clings to structures of 50 or 100 years ago, we find it very difficult to understand and to recognize what people actually do by way of transforming and learning. And so I want to find means of recognizing learning. What has somebody done? So that's my first question. What has somebody done? And then the question is, what has somebody done in relation to the prompt or the environment in which they did it? So that turns it around from, here it says, this is what the child was given as a prompt, this is what she has done or he has done, and kind of look at that difference. What has been transformed? What has been moved from speech into image? What has been moved from writing into something else?
Thank you.
Bueno, agradecer al profesor Kress la magnífica disertación, y yo creo, así lo he entendido yo, que ha dado con uno de los principales problemas del uso de las TIC y los medios y los nuevos lenguajes en la enseñanza y en la elaboración de recursos didácticos adecuados, de materiales adecuados a la enseñanza. Yo creo que, y se lo pregunto a él, que sabe más que yo, que está trabajando en el Instituto de Educación, formando futuros profesores también, en cierto modo, si no ha llegado antes la capacidad tecnológica de crear documentos multimedia con diversos modes, en diversos soportes, que la capacidad de utilizarlos aprovechando su especificidad. Es decir, si al final no estamos, como él ha dicho, utilizando nuevos medios para viejas formas de comunicar, y si el profesorado está capacitado para asignar a cada lenguaje, a cada mode, su función específica y el contenido de comunicación que más se adapta a esa forma de comunicar. Si el gran problema que podemos tener ahora en las escuelas es que la fascinación de los nuevos medios ha hecho que los utilicemos con la misma falta de criterios que utilizábamos los viejos. Y si utilizan mucho, hay una comunicación multimodal, pero no necesariamente utilizando el tipo de lenguaje más adecuado a cada contenido.
I absolutely agree. One of the reasons I showed the Daily Telegraph blog is because you had an instance of that. Somebody maybe not as old as I am, but nearer my generation, using a new medium in a completely old-fashioned way. The school is hampered by, and when I say the school, I mean the school system politically controlled. Now, in England, one has to say it's beginning to become difficult to speak of a school system because the system is being smashed up. Schools are being privatized. The state is kind of shuttling off responsibility for schooling. So there won't be a system, but there'll be a kind of a fragmentation of kinds of schools. But let's assume, at the moment still, politicians tell the school what it should do. Politicians in their anxiety reach back 50 years to when they were in a school and say, that was pretty good, it's got me to where I am, and the school will need to do that. Of course, the school meets young people who live in a completely different society, and one of the most important differences is that the society I grew up in was a society in which the state was intact, the state and the society relation was intact, the relation between state, society and economy was intact, and all of that is broken. The state has given responsibility to the market, the neoliberal capitalist market in where I come from. I think we're in a similar sort of situation nearly. The state said, let us produce citizens. These are people who should be more or less in some ways possessive of the same values, the same skills, the same understandings, a kind of a sense of where they might end up in the labour market. The market says none of those things. It doesn't say, let's produce citizens. It says, let's produce consumers. The fundamental characteristic of a consumer is the characteristic of being able to choose. Choice is what defines a consumer now. So young people have lived all their lives with the notion of choice, not with the notion of authority and will tell you what's good, but I choose for myself. So somebody, a minister of education says, tell me what to do. The children say, well, actually, no, I know what I want. So there's incommensurate gaps. The second point is that we as academics, and it may be that the next speaker should be exempted from that and the previous speaker should be, but I myself think I have not done enough to provide teachers with a full understanding, the full competences translated into how these things could be done in the classroom. But I think probably beginning to do something which will change a teacher's outlook, for instance, in relation to the notion of learning. Learning is interpretation, and therefore not that secure sense of I say it, he absorbs it or she absorbs it, I say it, and this child from this cultural background, from this ethnic background, will interpret it in quite different ways. So I think it's a problem we all face at the moment. I have a job, I haven't done enough. Politicians stand against it, anxieties of parents stand against it, and the neoliberal market in any case says we want consumers. That's by way of an optimistic...
A ver, y después viene una persona de allí detrás, que haya pedido la palabra. Gracias. Adelante.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Ana María y soy Social Media Manager. Quería hacer... Hola, buenas tardes. Quería hacer una reflexión y a ver qué le parece al ponente. Llevo todo el día escuchando hablar sobre educación, sobre redes sociales. Algunas ideas se me quedan muy clavadas. Por ejemplo, el tema de la necesidad de que esta inmersión en los medios sociales empiece desde las primeras edades. Entonces, mi pregunta va relacionada como que yo noto un poco como de separación entre dos medios. O sea, siendo el mismo medio social, siendo el mismo medio de comunicación, el mismo canal, Internet, la mayoría de los jóvenes, al fin y al cabo, de las personas que se supone a las que va dirigida esta charla, acceden a Internet a través de buscando un ocio, buscando una serie de contenidos distintos a los que estamos tratando aquí, que son la educación. ¿No sería conveniente empezar desde las bases para que los jóvenes no vieran solo Internet como un aspecto lúdico y de ocio? Bueno, pues esa era mi pregunta.
In English history, and I know that only by hearsay, I wasn't educated in England, there was a king called Harold. King Harold apparently lived in the 10th century, and he didn't like, one day he was at the seashore, he didn't like the tide coming in, you know, when the tide comes in. So he kind of picked up a shell and he kind of wanted to kind of turn the tide back by splashing the water back into the ocean. I think we cannot turn back that particular tide, and maybe we shouldn't. But I think what we should do is attempt to understand it. And really going to the point that you're saying, what is it that children actually... One of the questions I have for myself, like when I say, what are not social media, I also say to myself, when are we not learning? And when these children use whatever the medium is that they use, are they learning? Of course they're learning. They're engaging in semiotic work. They're learning. Are they doing it in an unprincipled fashion? Of course they're not. They're using principles. But it's my job to attempt to understand the principles which the children use in what is pleasurable activity. And then it's my job as an academic, and this is why I say I haven't done enough, it's my job as an academic to say, all right, I can see principles. Semiotic work is being done here. I want certain kinds of things. How would my intentions and wishes connect with their principles? Rather than saying, we'll put an interactive whiteboard up on the wall and use it in a very old-fashioned way, although the resources are different, sort of beginning to pay attention to the principles which young people bring to bear on their interaction, their use of the media, in whatever way we can, taking those seriously. Not as frivolous, not as banal, not as kind of silly. And in that kind of attempting to come closer again to the creativity, the transformative energy that children have, but not immediately, therefore, this bit of curriculum, I'll kind of use this sort of medium because they use it too. It's a slow job on our part to begin to understand, and actually I think to begin to take children seriously. Again, I mean, taking children seriously is an age-old kind of thing. We see the child as kind of born into innocence and bringing stuff with her or him. I think that's the task. What is education? I mean, in England and maybe in Spain too, the emphasis is now not on teaching but on learning. That also is a symbol of a social change in agency. The learner is central. So we should understand the learner. And the teacher becomes a facilitator in designing environments for learning which make it easy, pleasurable, significant for the learner to engage with these environments. That's a different task to the one we have at the moment, which is I'll construct a curriculum and you better absorb it.
Bien, la última palabra ya cortamos. Aquella persona de allí, vale, correcto.
¿Y se me escucha bien?
No.
Quería agradecerle su intervención, la cual me ha parecido muy interesante, en absoluto pedante, como dijo usted que iba a ser al principio. Y sobre todo me ha resultado bastante interesante la concreción en el concepto de medio y en el concepto de modo. Y entonces me ha traído un recuerdo muy agradable, ya que estamos aquí como en familia, entre amigos, se lo voy a comentar, sobre mi hijo. Bien, era un concurso, él tenía 2 años y medio, era un concurso de plastilina. Entonces él se presentó al concurso, hizo como una placa de plastilina y le dio un poco de volumen y eso fue lo que presentó en el concurso. Entonces el tribunal del concurso le llamó porque era una cosa muy rara y le dijo, ¿esto qué es? Y él salió y explicó lo que era. Y era lo siguiente, dijo, esto es una cueva, y con sus manitas también lo explicó, que era muy pequeño, dice, esto es una cueva, dentro está la mamá loba, que está saliendo muy preocupada porque su hijito el lobito ha salido de paseo y tarda mucho en llegar. Y lo explicaba todo con las manos, lo cual me resultó tremendamente precioso porque es un medio y he utilizado muchísimos modos, ¿no?, a la hora de comunicar. Espero haberme adaptado a su concepto, más o menos yo lo he interpretado de esa forma, ¿no? Yo, viendo las capacidades que tenía mi hijo en ese sentido, ¿no?, y ya muchas más que había visto, seguí potenciándole esa capacidad creativa y la verdad es que mi hijo ya tiene 18 años, es un chaval bastante despierto y con unas características, bueno, que voy a decir, soy su madre, pero quería comentarle esta experiencia, solo era eso.
I think you're entitled to be proud as a mum. And he hasn't run away from home.
No.
Thank you very much for that example.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Le damos también las gracias a Gunther Kress por estar aquí en España con nosotros y habernos dado esta conferencia tan interesante. Sentimos tener que cortar, pero ya está el siguiente ponente esperando. Muchas gracias a todos. Sara.